Part 1 of Chapter 19 of My Bondage and My Freedom by Frederick Douglass, narrated by Greducator. The Runaway Plot. List of chapter topics. New Year's thoughts and meditations. Again bought by Freeland. No ambition to be a slave. Kindness, no compensation for slavery. Incipient steps toward escape. Considerations leading thereto. Irreconcilable hostility to slavery, solemn vow taken, plan divulged to the slaves, Columbian orator, scheme gains favor despite pro-slavery preaching, danger of discovery, skill of slaveholders in reading the minds of their slaves, suspicion and coercion, hymns with double meaning, value in dollars of our company, preliminary consultation, password, conflicts of hope and fear, difficulties to be overcome, ignorance of geography, survey of imaginary difficulties, effect on our minds, Patrick Henry, Sandy becomes a dreamer, route to the north laid out, objections considered, frauds practiced on freemen, passes written, anxieties as the time drew near, dread of failure, appeals to comrades, strange presentiment, coincidence, the betrayal discovered, the manner of arresting us, resistance made by Henry Harris, its effect, the unique speech of Mrs. Freeland, our sad procession to prison, brutal jeers by the multitude along the road, passes eaten, the denial, Sandy too well loved to be suspected, dragged behind horses, the jail a relief, a new set of tormentors, slave traders, John, Charles, and Henry released, the author left alone in prison, he is taken out and sent to Baltimore. I am now at the beginning of the year 1836, a time favorable for serious thoughts. The mind naturally occupies itself with the mysteries of life in all its phases, the ideal, the real, and the actual. Sober people look both ways at the beginning of the year, surveying the errors of the past and providing against possible errors of the future. I, too, was thus exercised. I had little pleasure in retrospect, and the prospect was not very brilliant. Notwithstanding, thought I, the many resolutions and prayers I have made in behalf of freedom, I am, this first day of the year 1836, still a slave, still wandering in the depths of spirit-devouring thraldom. My faculties and powers of body and soul are not my own, but are the property of a fellow mortal, in no sense superior to me, except that he has the physical power to compel me to be owned and controlled by him. By the combined physical force of the community, I am his slave, a slave for life. With thoughts like these, I was perplexed and chafed. They rendered me gloomy and disconsolate. The anguish of my mind may not be written. At the close of the year 1835, Mr. Freeland, my temporary master, had bought me of Captain Thomas Auld for the year 1836. His promptness in securing my services would have been flattering to my vanity had I been ambitious to win the reputation of being a valuable slave. Even as it was, I felt a slight degree of complacency at the circumstance. It showed he was as well pleased with me as a slave as I was with him as a master. I have already intimated my regard for Mr. Freeland, and I may say here, in addressing Northern readers, where there is no selfish motive for speaking in praise of a slaveholder, that Mr. Freeland was a man of many excellent qualities, and to me quite preferable to any master I ever had. But the kindness of the slave-master only gilds the chain of slavery, and detracts nothing from its weight or power. The thought that men are made for other and better uses than slavery thrives best under the gentle treatment of a kind master. But the grim visage of slavery can assume no smiles which can fascinate the partially enlightened slave into a forgetfulness of his bondage, nor of the desirableness of liberty. I was not through the first month of this, my second year with the kind and gentlemanly Mr. Freeland, before I was earnestly considering and devising plans for gaining that freedom which, when I was but a mere child, I had ascertained to be the natural and inborn right of every member of the human family. The desire for this freedom had been benumbed while I was under the brutalizing dominion of Covey, and it had been postponed and rendered inoperative by my truly pleasant Sunday school engagements with my friends during the year 1835 at Mr. Freeland's. It had, however, never entirely subsided. I hated slavery always, and the desire for freedom only needed a favorable breeze to fan it into a blaze at any moment. The thought of only being a creature of the present and the past troubled me, and I longed to have a future with hope in it. To be shut up entirely to the past and present is abhorrent to the human mind. It is to the soul, whose life and happiness is unceasing progress, what the prison is to the body, a blight and mildew, a hell of horrors. The dawning of this another year awakened me from my temporary slumber and roused into life my latent but long-cherished aspirations for freedom. I was now not only ashamed to be contented in slavery, but ashamed to seem to be contented, and in my present favorable condition, under the mild rule of Mr. F., I am not sure that some kind reader will not condemn me for being over-ambitious and greatly wanting in proper humility when I say the truth, that I now drove from me all thoughts of making the best of my lot, and welcomed only such thoughts as led me away from the house of bondage. The intense desire now felt to be free, quickened by my present favorable circumstances, brought me to the determination to act, as well as to think and speak. Accordingly, at the beginning of this year 1836, I took upon me a solemn vow that the year which had now dawned upon me should not close without witnessing an earnest attempt, on my part, to gain my liberty. This vow only bound me to make my escape individually, but the year spent with Mr. Freeland had attached me as with hooks of steel to my brother slaves. The most affectionate and confiding friendship existed between us, and I felt it my duty to give them an opportunity to share in my virtuous determination by frankly disclosing to them my plans and purposes. Toward Henry and John Harris, I felt a friendship as strong as one man can feel for another, for I could have died with and for them. To them, therefore, with a suitable degree of caution, I began to disclose my sentiments and plans, sounding them, the while, on the subject of running away, provided a good chance should offer. I scarcely need tell the reader that I did my very best to imbue the minds of my dear friends with my own views and feelings. Thoroughly awakened now and with a definite vow upon me, all my little reading, which had any bearing on the subject of human rights, was rendered available in my communications with my friends. That, to me, gem of a book, the Columbian Orator, with its eloquent orations and spicy dialogues, denouncing oppression and slavery, telling of what had been dared, done, and suffered by men to obtain the inestimable boon of liberty, was still fresh in my memory, and whirled into the ranks of my speech with the aptitude of well-trained soldiers going through the drill. The fact is, I here began my public speaking. I canvassed, with Henry and John, the subject of slavery, and dashed against it the condemning brand of God's eternal justice, which it every hour violates. My fellow servants were neither indifferent, dull, nor inapt. Our feelings were more alike than our opinions. All, however, were ready to act when a feasible plan should be proposed. "Show us how the thing is to be done," said they, "and all else is clear." We were all, except Sandy, quite free from slave-holding priestcraft, It was in vain that we had been taught from the pulpit at St. Michael's the duty of obedience to our masters, to recognize God as the author of our enslavement, to regard running away an offense, alike against God and man, to deem our enslavement a merciful and beneficial arrangement, to esteem our condition in this country a paradise to that from which we had been snatched in Africa, to consider our hard hands and dark color as God's mark of displeasure, and as pointing us out as the proper subjects of slavery, that the relation of master and slave was one of reciprocal benefits, that our work was not more serviceable to our masters than our masters' thinking was serviceable to us. I say it was in vain that the pulpit of St. Michael's had constantly inculcated these plausible doctrines. Nature laughed them to scorn. For my own part, I had now become altogether too big for my chains. Father Lawson's solemn words of what I ought to be and might be in the providence of God had not fallen dead on my soul. I was fast verging toward manhood, and the prophecies of my childhood were still unfulfilled. The thought that year after year had passed away and my best resolutions to run away had failed and faded, that I was still a slave, and a slave too with chances for gaining my freedom diminished and still diminishing, was not a matter to be slept over easily, nor did I easily sleep over it. But here came a new trouble. Thoughts and purposes so incendiary as those I now cherished could not agitate the mind long without danger of making themselves manifest to scrutinizing and unfriendly beholders. I had reason to fear that my sable face might prove altogether too transparent for the safe concealment of my hazardous enterprise. Plans of greater moment have leaked through stone walls and revealed their projectors, but here was no stone wall to hide my purpose. I would have given my poor telltale face for the immovable countenance of an Indian, for it was far from being proof against the daily searching glances of those with whom I met. It is the interest and business of slaveholders to study human nature with a view to practical results, and many of them attain astonishing proficiency in discerning the thoughts and emotions of slaves. They have to deal not with earth, wood, or stone, but men, and by every regard they have for their safety and prosperity, they must study to know the material on which they are at work. So much intellect as the slaveholder has around him requires watching. Their safety depends upon their vigilance. Conscious of the injustice and wrong they are every hour perpetrating, and knowing what they themselves would do if made the victims of such wrongs, they are looking out for the first signs of the dread retribution of justice. They watch, therefore, with skilled and practiced eyes, and have learned to read with great accuracy the state of mind and heart of the slave through his sable face. These uneasy sinners are quick to inquire into the matter where the slave is concerned. Unusual sobriety, apparent abstraction, sullenness, and indifference, indeed any mood out of the common way, afford ground for suspicion and inquiry. Often relying on their superior position and wisdom, they hector and torture the slave into a confession by affecting to know the truth of their accusations. "You have got the devil in you," say they, "and we will whip him out of you." I have often been put thus to the torture on bare suspicion. This system has its disadvantages as well as their opposite. The slave is sometimes whipped into the confession of offenses which he never committed. The reader will see that the good old rule, quote, "A man is to be held innocent until proved to be guilty," does not hold good on the slave plantation. Suspicion and torture are the approved methods of getting at the truth here. It was necessary for me, therefore, to keep a watch over my deportment, lest the enemy should get the better of me. But with all our caution and studied reserve, I am not sure that Mr. Freeland did not suspect that all was not right with us. It did seem that he watched us more narrowly after the plan of escape had been conceived and discussed amongst us. Men seldom see themselves as others see them, and while to ourselves everything connected with our contemplated escape appeared concealed, Mr. Freeland may have, with the peculiar prescience of a slaveholder, mastered the huge thought which was disturbing our peace in slavery. I am the more inclined to think that he suspected us, because, prudent as we were, as I now look back, I can see that we did many silly things, very well calculated to awaken suspicion. We were, at times, remarkably buoyant, singing hymns and making joyous exclamations, almost as triumphant in their tone as if we had reached a land of freedom and safety. A keen observer might have detected in our repeated singing of, "O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan," something more than a hope of reaching heaven. We meant to reach the north, and the north was our Canaan. I thought I heard them say there were lions in the way. I don't expect to stay much longer here. Run to Jesus, shun the danger. I don't expect to stay much longer here, was a favorite air and had a double meaning. In the lips of some it meant the expectation of a speedy summons to a world of spirits, but in the lips of our company it simply meant a speedy pilgrimage toward a free state and deliverance from all the evils and dangers of slavery. I had succeeded in winning to my, what slaveholders would call wicked, scheme, a company of 5 young men, the very flower of the neighborhood, each of whom would have commanded $1,000 in the home market. At New Orleans they would have brought $1,500 apiece, and perhaps more. The names of our party were as follows: Henry Harris, John Harris, brother to Henry, Sandy Jenkins, of root memory, Charles Roberts, and Henry Bailey. I was the youngest but one of the party. I had, however, the advantage of them all in experience and in a knowledge of letters. This gave me great influence over them. Perhaps not one of them, left to himself, would have dreamed of escape as a possible thing. Not one of them was self-moved in the matter. They all wanted to be free, but the serious thought of running away had not entered into their minds until I won them to the undertaking. They all were tolerably well off, for slaves, and had dim hopes of being set free some day by their masters. If anyone is to blame for disturbing the quiet of the slaves and slave masters of the neighborhood of St. Michael's, I am the man. I claim to be the instigator of the high crime, as the slaveholders regard it, and I kept life in it until life could be kept in it no longer. Pending the time of our contemplated departure out of our Egypt, we met often by night and on every Sunday. At these meetings we talked the matter over, told our hopes and fears and the difficulties discovered or imagined, and, like men of sense, we counted the cost of the enterprise to which we were committing ourselves. These meetings must have resembled, on a small scale, the meetings of revolutionary conspirators in their primary condition. We were plotting against our so-called lawful rulers with this difference, that we sought our own good and not the harm of our enemies. We did not seek to overthrow them, but to escape from them. As for Mr. Freeland, we all liked him and would have gladly remained with him as freemen. Liberty was our aim, and we had now come to think that we had a right to liberty against every obstacle, even against the lives of our enslavers. We had several words expressive of things important to us, which we understood, but which, even if distinctly heard by an outsider, would convey no certain meaning. I have reasons for suppressing these passwords, which the reader will easily divine. I hated the secrecy, but where slavery is powerful and liberty is weak, the latter is driven to concealment or to destruction. The prospect was not always a bright one. At times, we were almost tempted to abandon the enterprise and to get back to that comparative peace of mind which even a man under the gallows might feel when all hope of escape had vanished. Quiet bondage was felt to be better than the doubts, fears, and uncertainties which now so sadly perplexed and disturbed us. The infirmities of humanity generally were represented in our little band. We were confident, bold, and determined at times, and again doubting, timid, and wavering, whistling like the boy in the graveyard to keep away the spirits. To look at the map and observe the proximity of Eastern Shore, Maryland, to Delaware and Pennsylvania, it may seem to the reader quite absurd to regard the proposed escape as a formidable undertaking. But to understand, someone has said a man must stand under. The real distance was great enough, but the imagined distance was, to our ignorance, even greater. Every slaveholder seeks to impress his slave with a belief in the boundlessness of slave territory, and of his own almost illimitable power. We all had vague and indistinct notions of the geography of the country. The distance, however, is not the chief trouble. The nearer are the lines of a slave state and the borders of a free one, the greater the peril. Hired kidnappers infest these borders. Then, too, we knew that merely reaching a free state did not free us, that wherever caught we could be returned to slavery. We could see no spot on this side of the ocean where we could be free. We had heard of Canada, the real Canaan of the American bondman, simply as a country to which the wild goose and the swan repaired the end of winter, to escape the heat of summer, but not as the home of man. I knew something of theology, but nothing of geography. I really did not at that time know that there was a state of New York, or a state of Massachusetts. I had heard of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, and all the southern states, but was ignorant of the free states generally. New York City was our northern limit, and to go there and to be forever harassed with the liability of being hunted down and returned to slavery, with the certainty of being treated 10 times worse than we had ever been treated before, was a prospect far from delightful, and it might well cause some hesitation about engaging in the enterprise. The case sometimes, to our excited visions, stood thus. At every gate through which we had to pass, we saw a watchman. At every ferry, a guard. On every bridge, a sentinel, and in every wood, a patrol or slave hunter. We were hemmed in on every side. The good to be sought and the evil to be shunned were flung in the balance and weighed against each other. On the one hand, there stood slavery, a stern reality, glaring frightfully upon us, with the blood of millions in his polluted skirts, terrible to behold, greedily devouring our hard earnings and feeding himself upon our flesh. Here was the evil from which to escape. On the other hand, far away, back in the hazy distance, where all forms seemed but shadows, under the flickering light of the North Star, behind some craggy hill or snow-covered mountain, stood a doubtful freedom, half-frozen, beckoning us to her icy domain. This was the good to be sought. The inequality was as great as that between certainty and uncertainty. This in itself was enough to stagger us, but when we came to survey the untrodden road and conjecture the many possible difficulties, we were appalled, and at times, as I have said, were upon the point of giving over the struggle altogether. The reader can have little idea of the phantoms of trouble which flit, in such circumstances, before the uneducated mind of the slave. Upon either side we saw grim death assuming a variety of horrid shapes. Now it was starvation, causing us, in a strange and friendless land, to eat our own flesh. Now we were contending with the waves, for our journey was in part by water, and were drowned. Now we were hunted by dogs, and overtaken and torn to pieces by their merciless fangs. We were stung by scorpions, chased by wild beasts, bitten by snakes, and worst of all, after having succeeded in swimming rivers, encountering wild beasts, sleeping in the woods, Suffering hunger, cold, heat, and nakedness, we supposed ourselves to be overtaken by hired kidnappers, who, in the name of the law, and for their thrice accursed reward, would perchance fire upon us, kill some, wound others, and capture all. This dark picture, drawn by ignorance and fear, at times greatly shook our determination, and not unfrequently caused us to, quote, rather bear those ills we had, than fly to others which we knew not of. I am not disposed to magnify this circumstance in my experience, and yet I think I shall seem to be so disposed to the reader. No man can tell the intense agony which is felt by the slave when wavering on the point of making his escape. All that he has is at stake, and even that which he has not is at stake also. The life which he has may be lost, and the liberty which he seeks may not be gained. Patrick Henry, to a listening Senate, thrilled by his magic eloquence and ready to stand by him in his boldest flights, could say, "Give me liberty or give me death," and this saying was a sublime one even for a free man, but incomparably more sublime is the same sentiment when practically asserted by men accustomed to the lash and chain, men whose sensibilities must have become more or less deadened by their bondage. With us, it was a doubtful liberty at best that we sought, and a certain lingering death in the rice swamps and sugar fields if we failed. Life is not lightly regarded by men of sane minds. It is precious, alike to the pauper and to the prince, to the slave and to his master. And yet, I believe there was not one among us who would not rather have been shot down than pass away life in hopeless bondage. In the progress of our preparations, Sandy, the root man, became troubled. He began to have dreams, and some of them were very distressing. One of these, which happened on a Friday night, was to him of great significance, and I am quite ready to confess that I felt somewhat damped by it myself. He said, "I dreamed last night that I was roused from sleep by strange noises, like the voices of a swarm of angry birds, that caused a roar as they passed, which fell upon my ear like a coming gale over the tops of the trees. Looking up to see what it could mean," said Sandy, "I saw you, Frederick, in the claws of a huge bird, surrounded by a large number of birds of all colors and sizes. These were all picking at you, while you, with your arms, seemed to be trying to protect your eyes. Passing over me, the birds flew in a southwesterly direction, and I watched them until they were clean out of sight. Now I saw this as plainly as I now see you, and furder, honey, watch de Friday night dream. There is sompin in it, shows you born. There is indeed, honey." I confess I did not like this dream, but I threw off concern about it by attributing it to the general excitement and perturbation consequent upon our contemplated plan of escape. I could not, however, shake off its effect at once. I felt that it boded me no good. Sandy was unusually emphatic and oracular, and his manner had much to do with the impression made upon me. The plan of escape which I recommended, and to which my comrades assented, was to take a large canoe, owned by Mr. Hamilton, and, on the Saturday night previous to the Easter holidays, launch out into the Chesapeake Bay and paddle for its head, a distance of 70 miles, with all our might. Our course, on reaching this point, was to turn the canoe adrift and bend our steps toward the North Star till we reached a free state. There were several objections to this plan. One was the danger from gales on the bay. In rough weather the waters of the Chesapeake are much agitated, and there is danger in a canoe of being swamped by the waves. Another objection was that the canoe would soon be missed, the absent persons would at once be suspected of having taken it, and we should be pursued by some of the fast-sailing bay craft out of St. Michael's. Then again, if we reached the head of the bay and turned the canoe adrift, she might prove a guide to our track and bring the land hunters after us. These and other objections were set aside by the stronger ones which could be urged against every other plan that could then be suggested. On the water, we had a chance of being regarded as fishermen in the service of a master. On the other hand, by taking the land route through the counties adjoining Delaware, we should be subjected to all manner of interruptions and very many disagreeable questions which might give us serious trouble. Any white man is authorized to stop a man of color on any road and examine him and arrest him if he so desires. By this arrangement, many abuses, considered such even by slaveholders, occur. Cases have been known where freemen have been called upon to show their free papers by a pack of ruffians, and on the presentation of the papers, the ruffians have torn them up and seized their victim and sold him to a life of endless bondage. The week before our intended start, I wrote a pass for each of our party, giving them permission to visit Baltimore during the Easter holidays. The pass ran after this manner, quote, "This is to certify that I, the undersigned, have given the bearer, my servant, John, full liberty to go to Baltimore to spend the Easter holidays. W.H., near St. Michael's, Talbot County, Maryland." Although we were not going to Baltimore and were intending to land east of North Point, in the direction where I had seen the Philadelphia steamers go, these passes might be made useful to us in the lower part of the bay, while steering toward Baltimore. These were not, however, to be shown by us until all other answers failed to satisfy the inquirer. We were all fully alive to the importance of being calm and self-possessed when accosted, if accosted we should be, and we more times than one rehearsed to each other how we should behave in the hour of trial. Those were long, tedious days and nights. The suspense was painful in the extreme. To balance probabilities, where life and liberty hang on the result, requires steady nerves. I panted for action, and was glad when the day, at the close of which we were to start, dawned upon us. Sleeping the night before was out of the question. I probably felt more deeply than any of my companions because I was the instigator of the movement. The responsibility of the whole enterprise rested on my shoulders. The glory of success and the shame and confusion of failure could not be matters of indifference to me. Our food was prepared, our clothes were packed up, we were all ready to go, and impatient for Saturday morning, considering that the last morning of our bondage.